let me introduce our panel to discuss, what are we going to discuss? Right to Know Day. Oh yeah, I forgot. This is a really significant issue, and Timothy's touched on it. Many speakers have touched on the centrality of the individual's right of access to any robust and legitimate regime of privacy or data protection. There are some practical consequences of that, and I wanted to have a practical session because I know many of you are practitioners, and dealing with this, most of you are not here as consumers, you're here as agencies that need to comply with these obligations, so we want to help you to do that. So I'm joined in the panel with three people eminently qualified to give you some tips and tricks to describe what might be coming in the future, and to talk about how to ready your organisation for the onslaught that will come from my having launched the About Me tool. Starting from my far right, Daimhin Warner is a former staff member of mine and my predecessors, and we were very sorry to see him go. He has gained some experience in the corporate world before hanging up his own shingle and offering services as a firm called Simply Privacy, which is an elegant name. Kathryn Dalziel will be known to many of you. Her firm is called Taylor Shaw still. Yes, it is. You haven't haven't changed that. Great. So Kathryn has been knocking around this area for as long as I have, and it's great to, most conversations I have with her are on stages like this, so we should have coffee sometime. But Kathryn offers really practical advice to clients throughout New Zealand, but particularly focusing in the Canterbury region where she is based, in those shaky isles, and I'm sure that the events of the last 5 years will inform some of her comments about preparedness. I asked her to give me the elevator pitch of what she was going to talk about today, and she said, "Be prepared." Jacqui Peace has joined Air New Zealand recently as a senior manager data protection. So her experience of the practical mechanics of delivering up access to information by individuals in a New Zealand context is a little more limited than the other two participants, but has amassed a significant amount of experience from a number of posts internationally. And I do think it's actually, one of the great values that we've had today is connecting this fundamental right that we enjoy and are obliged to provide in New Zealand with the international context, and not see these things as a burden of a particular South Pacific nanny state or an over-centred. We are an international world. These are international issues, and the perspective that Jacqui brings is extremely valuable. All right, we'll go back in reverse order. Jacqui, you have some observations for us on your experience and practice internationally, and I imagine you've seen a few things in your time at Air New Zealand.
My whole 4 weeks at Air New Zealand, yes. Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. I have been there for a whole 4 weeks. Had to bring some colleagues along with me to remind me that it's Air New Zealand I work for. And of those 4 weeks, I will add that I've been on holiday for 2. And I, thank goodness, booked an Air New Zealand flight for that holiday. But so I don't feel qualified, and I certainly am not as qualified as Daimhin or Kathryn to talk about access rights from a New Zealand perspective yet. I mean, I certainly understand Principle 6 very well, but in terms of my experience in New Zealand, no, I won't spend too much time, as John alluded to. But what I would like to talk about, and it was one of the things my holiday in the UK was about, attending the EU intensive about the General Data Protection Regulation, which is coming. And what I wanted to to show or put into context here from my angle really is that access or subject access rights are going to impact us as Air New Zealand because we are captured by this new General Data Protection Regulation, which they've been wrangling about for 4 or 5 years. I'm sure some of you have heard about it even. But whilst we sit down here comfortably in New Zealand thinking that that's happening over there, because Air New Zealand clearly, you know, we carry passengers, EU citizens, globally, we will be captured by what these new access rights will expect of us. So the obligations for us will extend beyond the simple, and I say simple with, you know, I don't mean to undermine it, the simple request for what information do you have about me? Our future will involve us having to respond when somebody says to that, what information do you have about me? And by the way, I'd like you to erase that information. Oh, okay. Gosh, where do we hold it? You know, we're robust enough to know where we're holding our information, but erasing it across all of those systems that we hold it, that's another, you know, can of worms. And then there's the thing about, oh, and by the way, you must tell me how long you retain my information for. Well, actually, some of our data, as Leah, my colleague, will attest to, we're holding it for 60 years. So I'm sorry, do I erase, you know, what do I erase? What obligations do I have? So there's another minefield. You know, we've got to not only tell people about what information we hold, we've now got to tell them about what, well, this is May 2018, I say, we've got to tell them about what periods of information we are holding it for, what retention periods are. Then we've got to give them the right to have it erased if they want it. In addition to that, we see coming our way an objection right, an additional very strong right for individuals to object to profiling. Now, I don't know about you, but I love those Air New Zealand ads, and I love getting grab a seat, you know, adverts telling me, hey, you could go here for this amount of money. So people can start to object to that, not just tick the opt-out box. And I was talking to a gentleman here from Marketing Association before, this is not just tick an opt-out box. They can come back to us now and say, actually, I don't want you to profile me anymore. I don't want any more direct marketing in such a way that actually, you know, I've got to make huge allowances for that in our marketing department, in our value customer department, in our new digital department. You know, those challenges will come as well. And I think an additional requirement of this new general data protection regulation that we've been caught in is that we also have to make that data portable. So hey, come on in, you know, come and ask me for all the data that we have about you so that we can package it up reasonably in a nice format that you can take it with you, and then you can go and give it to China Air or Emirates, because now that's the airline you'd like to travel with. And I have to do that with a smile, in the same way as I'm sure Spark and Chorus and so on, the Vodafones of this world have had to in the past, just, you know, say, here's my phone, I'm actually moving to a different organisation, a different telco provider now, I want my number. So we're going to have to do the same with the data. So at the moment, we have 2 years for this coming our way. What I guess the access rights are manageable at the moment, but I see them in the future internationally becoming far more challenging and far more transparent when we get it wrong. And far more financially, well, the impact financially is far greater than anything. I mean, you talked about $186,000. We're talking about now being caught in potentially 4% of annual revenue, global revenue. 4%. Now, I don't want to tell Christopher Luxon, you've had a great year, Mr. CEO of Air New Zealand, but now, just in case you get it wrong, 4% of that is in jeopardy. So we have some work to do. The new team I've got working, you know, colleagues alongside me, we've got some work to do beyond the subject access rights, which I guess, you know, from a practical sense, I'll have to put my hat on, my thinking hat on, that is, and try and figure out how we internationally as Air New Zealand meet those obligations. And I guess any tips that you can provide me for the, you know, for how I can do that would be great.
So can I just ask, so Air New Zealand as a company operating in jurisdictions representing a wide variety of approaches to privacy and data protection, does it make sense for you to adopt the high tide mark, to provide the gold standard everywhere you operate?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And for a couple of reasons. For data subject access rights, I think it does require us to look at the local requirements, because you can't get it wrong. The data protection authorities will start to obviously identify when we're getting it wrong. But also we need to adopt the highest standard. And unfortunately, I'm not saying that that means we'll apply everything that we do if we get an access request from Europe to what the access request might be for New Zealand, because we haven't thought that through yet. But yes, we'll look to adopt that as a benchmark.
I think the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, comes into force in 2018. So you have a little bit of time
I'm counting.
to get ready. But fascinating to see that the concept, I think Joe outlined to us, data across borders. What was it was a very nice phrase, but I've slipped out of my mind. And reciprocal remedies is the kind of idea that you're describing. Kathryn, can you tell us, you know, if you were going to give free advice to a non-paying client, which I'm about to ask you to do, what would that be? How do you? I mean, when I used to practice, I would be saying to clients, look, you want to deal with this in the most efficient way possible. You know, try not to make a big drama out of it. What's your approach?
Well, first of all, my first tip to Air New Zealand is to keep up the safety videos, but to not use Sports Illustrated ever again. But the main thing that I say to my clients, and I'll just go back to basic principles with Principle 6, it's there for a reason. It's there because we cannot control our personal information unless we see it. It's about transparency. And agencies should be transparent from the outset, but Principle 6 is really where individuals call them to account. So I remind clients that there's a good reason for this. I also remind clients that the other thing about Principle 6 is that if they don't get it right, the person does not have to show damages to satisfy the cause of action of an interference with privacy. In other words, you can breach Principles 1 to 5 and you can breach Principles 8 to 12 of the Privacy Act, and the person to establish an interference with privacy has got to show a privacy breach and they've got to show loss. Principle 6 and Principle 7, Principle 6 we're talking about, is so fundamental that Parliament has simply required that you show a breach. So it is important and something that needs to be incorporated into business. And they need to anticipate it. So following on from what Timothy was saying, it's really about having good data management systems and anticipating that these are coming. I'm also in advance, and I'm anticipating more now thanks to John's promotion of the right to know, I'm seeing increasing requests. The bulk of the requests that I'm seeing and dealing with are from aggrieved individuals who are having a go at the organisation and they want to see everything about them. And there is also now capacity across a large number of organisations to do data sweeps to see if their name comes up or the issues that they're dealing with the agency are there before it. And what gets revealed in those data sweeps are first of all, perhaps some inelegant data practices, but also staff members not complying with codes of conduct in the way that they're referring to people. So emails like, the nutter has contacted again, or things like that are starting to come through, and all of that is disclosable. So it's very important that that Principle 6 is tied into other good employment practice and good business practices of good behaviour. If you've got nothing nice to say nothing at all. It's time to go back to some of those basic manners.
If you've got nothing nice to say, you should open a Twitter account.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's just going back to some of those basic principles of organisation, understanding that these are coming. Managing timeframes is all really important, but also being ready to deal with the exceptions or the grounds on which you might withhold. Because you might have one email, but there might be content in it that you withhold. So one of the areas that I'm about to test, John, is the withholding the names of administrative staff members from emails. I've identified their roles to the requester, but I haven't identified their names, and that's about to come before you. So it's those are sorts of things that I think about withholding, because we're now balancing other staff's privacy rights and the consequences if an agency releases that information. So that's a practical one that comes up for me. Legal privilege is a very useful withholding ground. But I'm also entertained because I use Principle 6 probably a lot more than my colleagues do because I'm familiar with it. And I put in a request to an insurance agency the other day to have my client's transcript of an interview in an insurance investigation and alleged fraud sent to me under a Principle 6 request. And the agency came back and said, maintenance of the law, we don't have to disclose that, that's a withholding ground. And I said, you've got to satisfy how the withholding ground is protected by that, and just understand that if you don't provide this within 20 working days, I don't have to prove loss. And it was surprising how the transcript came back relatively quickly. It's a fantastic tool in practice, it's a useful business tool, and it's a good management tool. So I think that if we frame it positively, a lot of agencies see it negatively, but if we frame it positively and show that, because we can't avoid the fact we're managing data now, and that's the reality of it. I just am astounded that the conversation in New Zealand at the moment is about the consequences of a whole pile of documents from Panama coming out. There's no conversation over the fact that that came from a hack. We are holding on to huge data. Data retention, in my view, is a wonderful topic, because the longer you hold on to it, the more likely it can be hacked. So we're dealing with that environment. We've got to look after information, manage it, and get it ready for these requests.
Thank you. That's super insightful. I think when I was approaching this session, I was thinking, we're at the end, how do we help you guys deal with requests when they come in? And that's very instrumental and practical and a little bit technical sometimes. But the great insight, and I think that Kathryn has given us, is that knowing that right exists should be a really good way of improving the quality of information you collect and keep. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. So, when you're talking to yourself, when you see an inappropriate comment, say, look, would you feel comfortable about the information you're talking about seeing this? Because they're going to, if they ask for it.
That's right.
Very helpful. Thanks. Daimhin, why don't you, we haven't covered everything. There's plenty left.
Thank goodness. So I think Right to Know Day is a really good opportune moment for agencies to reframe the way that they consider privacy risk. I think as a result of recent events, major data breaches and the like that have been talked about today, a lot of agencies focus their privacy risk ideas and plans on concepts like confidentiality, security, and data breach responses. But I've been really surprised in the last few years to see how many agencies forget that the access right is there, and that, as Kathryn has noted, it can be the most common cause of action against a company by an individual. So I think that we should use the access right as a way of reframing the way that privacy is viewed by organisations. And as an example of this, I recently had a meeting with an executive leadership team in a big organisation, and they wanted to talk about privacy risk. And I said, well, let's talk about access and the release of information. And the chief risk officer said to me, yeah, we need to stop it, right? and what that was just saying to me was that there's an over-egging of the disclosure issues, and there's also a huge confusion about disclosure. Of course, data retention and data security are important, but they can't be so important that they trample on or create a barrier to an individual's access rights. So this executive leadership team thought they had privacy sussed when they said stop disclosure, and they confused disclosure with access, and they saw disclosure to a customer of information about themselves as akin to disclosing information that they shouldn't. It also came up recently when ACC, as you'll know, a lot of you will have seen ACC trucking out the story of their data breach and how they responded to it. KPMG talking about the work they did and all the great responses to it, which were excellent. But ACC has itself admitted that as a result of that event, it's focused its privacy strategy solely on data breach protection, on security. And there are a lot of issues that have gone by the wayside, and access is one of them. So they've openly talked about that in their presentations about the risks that they've faced. So I think, reframe privacy as being about openness and transparency, not about secrecy, not about shutting the doors, but about having the right doors open at the right times, if you put it that way. And from my experience working with John, working for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, but also working in the private sector more recently, I think there are 5 key issues that all agencies should consider getting right to respond to access requests properly. The first is recognition. I think that particularly in big agencies, staff aren't enabled to recognise a Privacy Act request, and organisations often don't understand what they look like and what they are. Hand in hand with that, and Kathryn's touched on this a lot, is understanding. Staff need to be enabled to understand what it looks like and how to respond to it. They need to understand what information is covered by an access request and not use responses like, oh, you can't have that because that's our information, which I heard a lot in my time representing people in the private sector. Process needs to be there. So organisations need to think really carefully about centralised processes for handling requests. Don't let them scatter across the agency. Bring them into a centralised team. Have a privacy officer who has full oversight over how they're being responded to. Because if you don't, what you'll find is that every part of a business handles them differently, has different understandings, and deals with them very specifically and subjectively. Context, number 4, I think that's really important. Privacy Act requests come up in very difficult contexts, and John, I'm sure you'll agree that that makes, for example, investigation of complaints about access requests exceedingly difficult. For example, a Privacy Act request might come up as part of an employment dispute, and an organisation will fight that release of information when in fact there is a lawful reason to release it, because they're embroiled in the employment dispute. So I think it's really important for organisations to split off context, ignore the context within which a Privacy Act request comes up, except, of course, when it comes to seeking to withhold information for proper basis. And then last point, and Kathryn touched on this is ability. I think agencies need to make sure they have the ability to respond to access requests, and it's incumbent on them to do so. You can't say your systems are so dispersed and so old and difficult to use that you can't respond to an access request. I think agencies have a responsibility to ensure that their systems enable them to respond quickly, and that can include using cloud computing services and making sure that those cloud computing services don't prevent them from accessing information about their customers and releasing it.
Thanks, Daimhin. Excellent tips, excellent tips. How big a problem could this be for your organisation? The Immigration Service, the Immigration New Zealand part of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, gets 28,000 privacy requests a year. That's Principle 6 requests. ACC, I haven't checked recently, but a presentation I saw a year or so ago said they have 100 editors on staff. That's FTEs. Think of the cost of that, the investment. The Ministry of Social Development currently has a backlog of at least 1,200, that's going up every week, and a wait list which exceeds the statutory limits. So, the other significant thing is that this has to be costed into your business. This is a baseline. It's got to be resourced. You've got to have support. This is a risk for the board. If you don't have the resource to deal with these things in a way that avoids the liability Kathryn is describing, then that's something that needs to go up and up and up until it reaches somebody who recognises the obligation. And I will now throw the discussion open to the floor, and I have an eager person here. Do you mind just holding till we get a microphone to you? Third down here, Marilyn, thank you.
Thank you. My question is about small organisations, not necessarily even small businesses, but small charities. The frameworks we're talking about are huge. The scope is vast. Where do they even begin?
They ring Kathryn.
I'm nodding because I quite often get inquiries from agencies receiving Principle 6 requests. The reality is that the obligations are the same, and you want good management techniques. The problem with charities and the problem with volunteer organisations is the emails are fraught with inappropriate discussions. And so I say to charities all the time, good behaviour principles, good conduct principles are really important regardless of whether you're a charity or a business. And people see emails as just a informal oral conversation. It's not, and even informal oral conversations should be disclosed. But the thing is that organisations have just got to start with those basic manner principles, professional principles, and they won't be caught out. But yes, they do need to go through their systems to look to see if there are names. You may not do it by a data sweep. You'll find that for most small organisations, the information's limited, and you can get to it quickly, and you need to go through each of the documents and make sure that if any of the withholding grounds apply. You need to think of it.
Thank
yeah,
you.
I would agree with that. And you're right, it's probably going to be a case of going through the spreadsheet and working it through.
Yeah.
The only other thing, can I just make one comment?
Sure, can I just put that to Daimhin? I just want to say, you get a call from a charity. The charity has found your name on the Privacy Commissioner's Directory of Privacy Professionals. See what I did there?
Thanks, John.
And they call you and they say, look, we've had a Principle 6 request and we haven't got any money to pay you. So what can you give us in 5 minutes to help us deal with this thing?
That's a disappointing scenario, I have to say. But it does come up a lot.
It's an opportunity.
No, I mean, I think I was interested by your comment that the frameworks are so huge and so grand. I think my 5-minute free advice would be, no, it's not. Actually, responding to an access request under Principle 6 is just good customer service. Part 5 of the Privacy Act sets out all of the procedural provisions around responding. And actually, if you pick them apart, all they are is being decent to people. It's about being open and transparent. It's about not being secret. It's about responding within the time frame of 20 working days. It's about giving people reasonable expectations and sticking to them. That is it. The only difficult legal question might be what should we release and what should we withhold, but I think in general my advice there would be as open as you possibly can. The more you withhold, the more paranoid people will become. It raises questions, it doesn't help anyone, but also there are defences in the Privacy Act. If you release information in good faith to an individual who's requested information about them, then you're protected from any legal liability for that release. So, you know, it's easy. It's not bigger than Ben-Hur. It's just about making sure that you follow good customer service.
That's a very good point. The often overlooked Section 115, otherwise known as the get out of jail free card. But you had a follow-up.
Well, it wasn't another question, it was just really a comment on the fact that one of the things I see with the smaller organisations is they'll worry about their clients, they'll worry about their customers, and they forget about their staff.
That's right.
Yep. Good point. Thank you. Well made. Other contributions or questions? Experience. Have you had an experience? Would you like to share with us? Well, over there, Marilyn.
I've just got a follow-up. Daimhin, your question about relying on the good faith exclusion to diversity.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's probably getting into a bit too much detail, but if I decide to release and don't go through any of those exceptions I could have relied on, and if, for example, I suppose it breaches someone else's privacy, could you still rely on that
That's a really good point.
I would have thought.
This comes up with the Official Information Act too, where government agencies try and rely. They say we were responding to a request under the Official Information Act, and obviously the Ombudsman has the power to review whether in fact they followed the right steps when they released that information. But I think I suppose the concept of good faith does require that you've turned your mind to the privacy interests of various individuals. I mean, I guess from a very purely pragmatic perspective, it takes an individual to make a complaint about your release to that customer or that employee before that's likely to become an issue. But yes, I do think good faith would require that you've shown that you've turned your mind to the various issues involved in releasing that information. So that would be my advice to an organisation, is you need to think about it, but be as open as you can.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for this esteemed panel? This is your chance to get free advice. I have a question, Jacqui. The biggest problem I see in this area is when an organisation has had kind of jumbled information management, and somebody who's worked there or been a customer or a beneficiary or both or all three, sometime later falls out and says, give me everything. And the job of bringing it together, of collating it, of taking out the bits, is really significant. This is the problem that some of our central government agencies have. If you had an opportunity to design your information system up front, thinking about the fact that sometime down the line individuals might exercise their right of access, would you do it? How would you do it?
Oh, I'd love to do it. And I mean, it's very hard. I've come from a systems IT background as well, so I know that actually it's really hard to do that. Legacy systems exist, and we've got a lot of old data sitting around we don't even necessarily always know. I'm not saying that's the case with Air New Zealand, what we've got. But the trends that I'm seeing now, and if I was given a lot of money and a blank slate to redesign, I would actually go with the view that actually our data is worth something to us as individuals now. So I think there's a move that we will start to want to own it and want to sell it ourselves to organisations, right? So we should own what goes into Air New Zealand or other airlines, etc., other businesses. But if I had the opportunity to design so that I could easily, readily, quickly respond to a request, it would be along the lines of something that's transparent and open, that was very secure, so that I, Jacqui Peace, could say to Air New Zealand, here's my code, encrypted, you know, and it's, show me now, let me go in and see what you've got about me, and I could go and look at everything. Because I've given it to you, you've given me $100 for it, I'm just putting stupid sums, but you've given me some money for it, I've sold it to you, now it's mine, you've got it, you're looking after it safely for me. Now I want to go in and see what you've got about me. And that's where I would like to get to now. That's a long way off. But Facebook, scourge of the earth sometimes, or whatever you like to, you know, they have a similar thing where if I want to ask for what information do you have about me, they will give you the opportunity to download.
Yep. You can get a CSV file.
Absolutely. You can get it readily accessible, portable, to take to your next social media provider that you want to move to. Snapchat or whoever.
So that's zero cost, isn't it, once you've designed? That's fantastic. Just very quickly, if I could throw it open to the two of you. I don't think Jacqui's had any experience in this area, but your client responds, sends information, says, I'm not sure about this, I'm going to withhold that, takes a bit longer than they should. Customer comes to me and complains. How do you advise your client to engage with my office?
Oh, be as difficult and impossible as possible.
That'll play well.
I think make it an adversarial process, QC up, and I think that that's quite an effective strategy. You'd agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I actually find dealing, you'll be pleased to know, and OPC staff, start writing this down for your work reviews, I find engaging with the staff absolutely fantastic. You're hitting time frames and issues because things have to be triaged and parked and things like that. So from our client's perspective, they would love it if it was resolved yesterday and they had to understand that they're into those processes. But I also quite often encourage clients to deal with you directly. They don't need me in the way to interrupt the conversation, and they're going to get the same advice, hopefully. So away they go.
Thank you. I wasn't fishing for compliments. I'm genuinely thinking about how to engage. I mean, one of the things that we are trying to do increasingly is to try and find resolutions of complaints and kind of get out of the way, let people restore these relationships. Is that appropriate where it's an access request? Should we resolve, or should we just say, okay, you can have, you're entitled to that, you can withhold that? Daimhin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the idea of resolution applies across the board with privacy, and we shouldn't sever off access and decide that that's where we, where the commissioner forms legal views on things all the time and follows a very strict legalistic approach. And if I can just share around the compliments, I want to note that I had a meeting recently with a large company that mentioned that they take an approach in Australia to working with the Information Commissioner's Office where, on a resolution basis, and have found that they have been extremely receptive and they're able to resolve things really quickly, and that they were talking about wanting to sort of reflect that practice back in New Zealand and do the same with your office. So, I think across the board there's an interest from agencies to resolve things before they get to the regulator. It happens in other jurisdictions, not just privacy, and it's given that customer experience is such a strong focus for organisations, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Oh, we have another question. Great. Last point. Just while you're waiting for the mic to come, I'll say, one of the rules I've given my staff about complaints is to say, when was the last time you resolved a dispute with a telephone company or a power company by sending a letter and getting one back and saying, no, that's not quite right, and writing another letter? This linear kind of process of a war of correspondence, and we're trying to cut through that and actually get to you and have a talk. So if we do get in touch with you, please don't be intimidated. We're trying to help. We're from the government.
Just from a risks perspective, I suppose, we all know that if we don't comply, it's automatically a breach and you don't have to show harm. I suppose, John, what is the going rate if you know, someone comes to you and says, so-and-so did not give me my information within 20 working days and didn't ask for an extension, what's the response, the regulatory response?
I don't practice as a lawyer anymore. But I would say that there is a really important distinction here that, you know, Kathryn's absolutely correct. The threshold for establishing what is an interference doesn't require harm. But when the tribunal, who's the only body that can issue damages, I can't, when the tribunal comes to determine what damages are payable, they do apply the principles of compensatory damages. So the going rate depends
Don't tell
on
people that.
the going rate depends on how it's affected the person, and that might be a trivial matter like having to wait 2 weeks and getting annoyed about it, and they might find they get an award of $300, $500 or something. It might mean they've missed a deadline for filing something which has had a real consequences, and it could go $2,500. There could be some real egregious harm that they've suffered, which has left them anxious and seriously aggrieved, which warrants a much higher award, and you might even be looking into the $20,000, $30,000 mark for those kinds of things.
In most instances, it's because I've had to write a letter and then they suddenly react to it, that we just get the legal costs back.
Just on that, John, would you agree, though, that the tribunal recently has been awarding damages in a way that also just recognises the fundamental right of Principle 6?
Yes.
And there's been sort of conversation in the tribunal about people feeling disempowered, and you know, I think that's could be quite alarming for agencies. I think it's probably quite a good thing for privacy, that it's really this fundamental concept that feeds into the damages assessment as well.
Excellent, thank you. Look, I'm going to draw this session to a close, and I want to thank the panellists. That's been very helpful, and I hope you realise just how valuable that was for you.
We take
Not
donations
entirely
at the
for free,
door.
but you know, I mentioned the Directory of Privacy Professionals. These people, I don't think Jacqui's on it. She doesn't offer her services. She'd get in trouble there in New Zealand. But these other guys are. There's a list of people who can help you with this stuff if you need to. But of course, my office is there to help. So please give us a call, send us an email, whatever. But I'd like to thank our panellists. Thank you very much.